So I got the word though before, so that was pretty cool actually. It is a huge honor to be here for a number of reasons. First, because as you heard, I am a Nashville native and don't get to speak very often in my own hometown. I've been back in this town for about 17 years since moving back here from New Orleans, where I was in college and really began doing anti-racism and civil rights work. So whenever I get to come home, so to speak, and speak anywhere in the city of Nashville, it's a huge honor. It's also a huge honor in particular for me to speak at any type of Black History Month celebration, because even though, as I'm fairly confident you can tell, I'm not, black, the fact remains that throughout the course of my life, both growing up here in this city and especially going to school and becoming an activist in New Orleans, the primary mentors, the primary teachers who molded me as both a thinker on these issues but also as an activist on these issues were in fact African American men and women with whom I worked in the city of New Orleans and also with whom I've worked here. And so whenever I get to come and present during this month in particular, I'm honored because I realize at a very deep level what a huge responsibility it is for anyone to stand up during Black History Month and speak to the legacy of the equal rights and civil rights struggle in this country, but especially for someone who is white to be chosen to do that, to speak to that legacy, to connect to that legacy in front of anyone, let alone young people. And so it's a huge honor to be here. And I want us, among all else that I would like for you to remember today and throughout the course of this month, is that, and I think your teachers and administrators would want you to know this, that history, this thing that we commemorate, in particular Black history, but history in general, is not this dead thing that we study just because our teachers want us to, just because our parents think it's important because they lived through it, right? Like, we can understand older folks thinking history is important because that's their life and they want you to learn it, right? But history isn't just this dead thing that we study for fun or because someone tells us that we must. We study it, and I hope that we learn from it because our past as a nation, as a people, as a society fundamentally affects who we are in the present. And more to the point, it affects and often even dictates who we will become as a nation in the future. We have a responsibility, each and every one of you and of us in the larger society, to take the world and our country as we find it and strive against whatever obstacles we face to make it into that thing and that place that it should be and that it can be. That is the history that we celebrate during something like Black History Month, the history of a people who always in every generation understood that it was important for them never to be satisfied with the promise of America that existed on paper, but rather that they had to struggle to make that promise real in practice and in their everyday lives, because it certainly wasn't real and hasn't been real for the vast majority of our country's history. And I'm sure that for those of us who are not African American men and women, boys and girls, it is often easy for us to think that the Black struggle is not our struggle and that their fight is not our fight. And yet what we have to remember, those of us who are not Black, is that in every generation, going all the way back to the colonial period before this country was even a country, and in every generation since, there have been white folks like Bob and Dottie Zellner, Connie Curry, Paul LaPrade, right here in this city, who played an instrumental role in the sit-in movements that broke the back of racist segregation in this town, who have played a role side by side with their Black brothers and sisters in spite of the fact that they could have sat on the sidelines, that they didn't have to get involved. It wasn't a system that was aimed at them, and yet they understood their moral obligation. And there have always been Latino and Latina folks, not Black either, but Latino and Latina folks, Cesar Chavez, Betita Martinez, and others who understood that the Black struggle was their struggle. Asian American folks like Grace Lee Boggs, who understood that the Black freedom struggle was a struggle for the freedom and liberation of all people of color in a society that, frankly, whether we want to admit it or not, was set up as a system of white racial supremacy. Or perhaps we do understand that. Perhaps we know that their fight is our fight, but yet perhaps we've come to the conclusion that that fight is over, because I guess for some people it's easy to think that way. To feel that yes, that struggle was important, and yes, we study it in history, but do we really have to talk about continuing it? After all, you can look around and you can see all these outward signs, these outward manifestations that we've changed dramatically in the last 50 years. And some of those signs are genuine, and some of them can occasionally confuse us and make us think that we have made more progress than we really have. And so I understand when folks ask the question, why do we have to keep talking about racism and discrimination? Right? When we have a black president, isn't it done? Aren't we finished? Can't we move on to something else? And yet, I would want you to understand, if you learn nothing else today, that there is a huge difference between individual accomplishment and society-wide transformation. And the fact that a man of color can become president of this country certainly says something about us as a nation that we couldn't have said even 20 years ago, let alone 50. But what it doesn't say is that the struggle for equal opportunity is completed. Now, how do we know that? Well, here's one way that we know it. And speaking to a room filled with women, it is particularly important that I give you this example above all else. If I were to say to the women here that in Pakistan, for instance, you as women would have fully equal opportunity and be treated equally with men, and that the only reason I say that is because, a woman, Benazir Bhutto, was elected not once but twice in that country. The first time in 1988. If I were to tell you that the mere fact that a woman had been the head of Pakistan meant that you would now have equal opportunity if you packed your bags and moved to Karachi, right? I suspect that you would know that might not be accurate. If I were to tell you that women in Israel or India or Great Britain or the Philippines, all of which countries have had women as their heads of state, as their presidents, right, as their prime ministers, etc. If I were to tell you that just the fact that those women had run the country meant that there was no sexism operating in those places, that women and girls were treated fully equally, my guess is that you would know better. My guess is that my own 9-year-old daughter, even though she knows nothing about Pakistan, Israel, India, Great Britain, or the Philippines, is yet smart enough to say, no, Daddy, I don't think that's right. Because even she at 9 years old would understand that individual accomplishment, though it's a big deal, and it does mean something, doesn't tell us that the millions of other women in those countries, or that the millions of other people of color in our country, are necessarily really being treated in an equitable and fair fashion. So we have to distinguish between individuals who attain great power and the larger system in which we all live. Because we are still not an equal opportunity society. And I don't blame you if you don't know that. Because after all, we don't talk about this very much. But our politicians don't talk about it when they run for office in either of the two major political parties. Our media don't like to talk about it. We have this attitude, I fear, in this country that the less we talk about racism and discrimination, the better. You'll even hear people say that. Why keep talking about this? They'll say this to me. They'll write me. Right? They'll email me. And you always know the email is going to be really crazy when it's all capital letters. You know you're in trouble when somebody's screaming at you electronically like they're right next to you. And but I read them anyway because I'm fascinated by the degree of derangement that's involved when somebody does that. So they yell at me electronically. It says, if you would just stop talking about racism, if you would stop talking about racial discrimination, then everything would get better. It's people who talk about it that keep it a problem. Now, I want you to really think about this. Is there any other problem on the planet about which you would say that? About which you would say, what the solution is silence. Let's just not talk about it. Let's think about some other problems. If I were to say that about world hunger, right? You'd probably think I'd lost my mind. If I were to say, for instance, there are millions, even billions of children around the planet who are dying because they don't have enough food, but any of you go, shh. Good God, don't talk about that. If you talk about starving children, people will starve. If you just wouldn't talk about that, food would miraculously appear on the plates of the hungry. My God, what an amazing solution. Why didn't anyone think of that? Silence doesn't even cost anything, right? We wouldn't have to have governments send food. Bono would not have to do anything. The problem would have been solved. My goodness. Or if I were to say, you're worried about crime? Yeah, crime, certain communities, crime's a real problem. People getting held up at gunpoint, shot. Oh my, don't talk about that. If you talk about crime, someone is going to get carjacked this afternoon, right? No one would say that. In every case, we would understand that silence means you can't solve the problem. If you don't talk about it, you can't deal with it. That's not just true with racism and discrimination. That's true with any social problem. So we don't need to talk less. We need to talk more. But we can't just talk. We have to talk honestly. And we have to talk about the things that maybe our leaders, so-called, don't want to talk about because it's uncomfortable, because they're afraid it might cost them votes, because they're afraid it's going to upset people, and so we just sort of keep it on a very low and often dishonest level. So what does it mean to talk honestly about issues of racism and discrimination? Well, here's the fact. Today, not 20 years ago, not 50 years ago during the civil rights struggle, not 100 years ago, but right now as I speak to you, just to give you an idea of how unequal a society we still are, in spite of the real progress that we've made. Right now, black folks with a college degree who did everything right, everything the society asked of them, stayed in school, went to college, got a college degree. Black folks with a college degree are still twice as likely as whites with a degree to be unemployed, unable to find a job. Latino folks with a degree, about 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans with a degree, about a third more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. In other words, people of color, even when they have comparable credentials to their white counterparts, still do not have, for a number of reasons, among them, ongoing discrimination by folks who don't think they're as capable. As a result of that, they continue to have less opportunity in the job market. But it's not just jobs, it's even life itself. According to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, every single year in this country right now, not 20 and 50 years ago, but even as of 2012, and no doubt will be the same at the end of 2013, every year about 85,000 African American men and women will die because of unequal access to health care compared to white folks, because they live in neighborhoods that are disproportionately close to toxic waste facilities or hazardous waste facilities, or where the buildings have been painted long ago with lead paint, all of which has a direct effect on the health and the development of children growing up in those communities. So the struggle for equal health care, the struggle for comparable quality neighborhoods, the struggle for economic justice then has a racial impact that is literally resulting in the loss of life for black folks every year, tens of thousands of people who would not die if this society were truly providing for them equal opportunity in terms of health, in terms of neighborhood access, in terms of economic opportunity. That's a significant problem, and it's interesting, isn't it, when one individual is killed because of racism or injustice. We all hear about it. It becomes national news. Many years ago in 1998, and I know this will not be within the trajectory of your memories for those of you who were students, but nonetheless, it was a relatively famous case. A black man named James Byrd, this was 15 years ago, was killed because 2 or 3 individual racist white men decided that he didn't deserve to live, and they dragged him behind a truck until he died. And it was a horrible crime, reminiscent of the old days of segregation, reminiscent of the old days of blatant racism. And it made national news. It was in all the papers. It was on all the television stations, as it should have been. It was a newsworthy event. But why is it that as a society we hear about the one man who's killed because of racism? And we lament that, and we're upset about that, as we should be, but we don't even hear about the 85,000 folks of color who are dying because of institutional inequality. That doesn't make the news. And for most of you, you probably never heard that number until I shared it with you 2.5 to 3.5 minutes ago. Right? So as a society, we focus on the one dead person. We don't focus on the injury to tens of thousands. That's because at some level, it's hard, isn't it? It's scary. Because when it's just the one guy who was murdered by racist people, we can say, well, that's not us. We would never do that to anyone. We're better than that. Those are bad people and we're good people, so we wash our hands of it. But if our society, the society we all share, the society we all have to take responsibility for, is resulting in such unequal life opportunities for people, that is on us, isn't it? And it makes it a lot more difficult, because then we have to figure out what we're going to do. We have to figure out what kind of pressure we're going to bring on, whether it's a president or a senator or a congressperson or a mayor or a state legislator. Right? We have to think about how we're going to turn that situation around. And so that is why it's so important for us to keep our eyes wide open, to realize that for every bit of progress we've made, and again, it has been real, there are still real people in the real world every day in our own city, in our state, and across this country who are literally dying because of unequal opportunity. And even if they aren't dying, they're suffering unequal educational opportunities. They're suffering unequal job opportunities, unequal housing opportunities. That is something we all have to care about, because not only is it a moral obligation, like it was 50 years ago for those folks right here in this city who led the sit-in movement downtown, right? But it's not just that, it's also a practical obligation. Because the fact is, and some of you may have heard this statistic before, in about 20 to 30 years from now, the United States is going to be about half white folks and half people of color. And that's a fact. It doesn't matter what folks think about it. I know there are some people who aren't happy with that, and they don't like the fact that the country is changing, but it really doesn't matter whether they like it or whether they don't. How you feel about it means nothing. That change is real. It is upon us. We are going to be a new country. We are going to be a different place than we were when our parents were young and our grandparents. And for me, I believe that's a wonderful thing. But whether you think it's wonderful or not, it simply is a thing. And so then the question is, what do we do with that? What do we do to make sure that when we get to that day, we're a more equal place? Because if we don't do that, we're going to be in real trouble. Can you imagine a country where half the folks are white, half the folks are people of color, if we still have massive inequality? How do you maintain a healthy society for anyone? How do you maintain a healthy economy for anyone? How does anyone have good functioning schools if you've got one half of the population twice as likely as the other half to be out of work, 3 times as likely as the other half to be poor, 9 years less life expectancy than the other half, considerably less opportunity? That's not going to work for anyone. So if we want this country to move forward, not only for the benefit of black folk and other folks of color, but for white folks as well, as a functioning society, as the country that we proclaim ourselves to be, we have some work to do. And the work that we have to do has to be done, even though I am fully aware that none of you in this room is to blame for the country the way it has been. None of us created it this unequal. None of us are at fault. But all of us have to be accountable to the country as we find it and responsible for changing it if we have a problem with it. You see, guilt and responsibility aren't the same thing. None of us are guilty of having set it up this way, but responsibility is very different than guilt. Guilt is what you feel when you do something wrong, right? It's what you feel for the stuff you've actually done. Responsibility is something that you take because of the kind of human being that you are. And just to give you an idea of what I mean by that, I want to close out by telling you a story. This story, by the way, has nothing at all to do with racism or discrimination or people dying because of injustice, which is to say all the really hard stuff is done. Right? This is the easy stuff. But even though the story isn't about that, when I'm done telling it, I want you to get from it a lesson about those things and what our obligations are to address those things. It's a story about something that happened to me when I was just out of college. So I graduated from Tulane in May of 1990. And upon graduating, I came to the really genius decision, and I'm being sarcastic now, it was not smart at all. I came to the really genius decision that the best thing I could possibly do would be to move into a very large house with 9 other people. Right? Okay, little life advice, and if you do not remember another thing I say today, for the love of God, please write this down. Like, tweet this to yourself. Put it on your Facebook wall or your Google Plus or whatever. Just like write it on the back of the person in front of you. Tattoo it. No, don't tell your parents I said you get a tattoo. I don't mean that. But just remember it, because it's the most important lesson that you'll ever learn about anything. Anything, right? And this is the lesson ultimately that I learned, which was you should never move into a large house with 9 other people. It's a horrible idea. It's not going to work out at all. We thought it was going to be cool, though, because, you know, when you're just out of college, you're going to be broke. Surprise, for those of you who will be going to college soon. Just so you know, you get out of school, you don't have any money, and you think to yourself, well, hey, if we move into a big house with 10 people, we'll at least save money. That's true. Very true. We were saving money. Rent was $525 a month. I don't mean per person. I mean, total, which, even in 1990 dollars was really good. Like, I know most of you don't really remember 1990, and that makes me very sad. But nonetheless, the reality is that even in 1990, $52.50 a month per person was really good, right? So we thought, oh, it's going to be fine. We don't even have to like each other. We just have to sort of not kill each other, and at least we'll save money. So we went for it. We moved in, and about 6 weeks into this thing, I came to understand why it had been a terrible mistake. This is how I learned it, right? So I learned my lesson one night. I was working downtown in a Came back uptown on the streetcar, got off the streetcar, walked 5 blocks into the neighborhood where I was living, walked up the steps of the house, opened the door, and I was met by this incredible smell. And I mean that in a good way, which is rare. When you live with 9 other people, most of the smells you meet are not good. This one, on the other hand, was really good. It was the smell of dinner being prepared for the whole house by one of the roommates, because we didn't just split bills, we also took turns cooking, and it was his turn to cook. And that night he was making a big pot of gumbo, which if you've never been to New Orleans may not mean anything to you, but it's a thing, okay? It's like soup, only way better. And it was a big pot of gumbo, and he was making it on the left front burner of the stove, right? And man, it smelled good. And it looked good. And it even had shrimp in there. Not many, like I said, we were broke, but there were like three shrimp. 3 of those incredibly tiny shrimp, those shrimp that are so small, they make popcorn shrimp look like jumbo shrimp. They make jumbo shrimp look like lobsters, right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. So I was excited at the possibility of seafood gumbo, but here's the catch. As it turned out, I'd already had dinner. I didn't know my roommate was making gumbo. If I'd known, I might have waited and just had dinner at home, but I didn't know, so I'd already eaten. And when he asked me if I wanted any, I said, no, man, I'm good, but do me a favor, take some of that, put it in the fridge in a container. I'll take it to work tomorrow for lunch because it looks good. He said, cool, I'll do that. I said, fine. So I went upstairs, hung out with the roommates, did whatever we did for fun in 1990, which was not much. It was sort of the stone ages of technology. Social networking was like you just walked down the hall and knocked on your neighbor's door and you're like, hey, what's up? And they said, nothing, it's 1990. And so then you just went to bed. So I went to bed sort of early. I woke up the next morning. I go downstairs to get coffee to get ready for work. I look and I notice that pot of gumbo is still on the left front burner of the stove, right where it had been the night before. And trust me, it did not smell as good as it had the night before. And it did not look nearly as appetizing as it had the night before. So I wasn't real happy. And I was, in fact, particularly upset because my roommate had neither saved any of it for me, like he told me he would, nor had he cleaned the pot. Right? He left it for me or one of the other 9 roommates, I suppose, to clean. So I wasn't pleased with him, but I said, you know what, whatever, I'll clean it. And then when I get back from work tonight, I'm going to take it up with him and tell him how displeased I am at his general nastiness. So I took the pot of gumbo and I brought it over to the sink and I got the scrub brush and I got the soap and I started to run the water. And just before I let the water go into the pot to start cleaning this thing, I stopped myself. Right? And I was like, hey, man, I don't have to do this. I didn't make this mess. I didn't even eat any of this mess. Now I felt really self-righteous, right? And very intelligent because I had talked myself out of doing the hard work, which is the talent I learned in college. So stay tuned. You too will learn how to not do really hard work in college. It was a lesson I had learned very, very well. And so I was very proud of myself. I took the pot of gumbo, put it right back where I found it, marched off to work, right? Came back that night about 20 after 6. And I noticed that pot of gumbo was still on the left front burner of the stove. Another roommate was making dinner on the right front burner, mind you. But on the left front burner is still this nasty, increasingly disgusting, right, horrible smelling, foul thing sitting there on the left front burner. I looked at my roommate and I said, okay, now look, you're going to have to explain to me how it is you can make dinner on the right front burner of the stove when I am fairly confident you can smell last night's dinner because it's right there. Why don't you clean it? And he, being also college educated and thus smart, said to me, well, I wasn't here for dinner last night. I neither made the gumbo nor ate any of the gumbo. Then he looked at me and pointed a finger in my direction and said, did you have any of the gumbo? I'm like, hey man, don't look at me. I didn't do it. And then we both knew what that meant. Neither one of us were going to clean it. And he said, so, would you like some lentils and rice? And I said, self-righteously, yes, as a matter of fact, I would. So I ate my dinner, I cleaned the plate, I put it in the dish rack to dry, and I went upstairs, hung out with the roommates, listened to music again, did whatever we did in 1990, which is to say I was in bed by 8 o'clock, and that was it. The next morning, 7 a.m. comes. I had forgotten to set an alarm. But here's a little tip, and I probably don't have to actually tell you this, but I will anyway, because it's part of the speech. If you are living in a really large house where there is a pot of gumbo that has been sitting on the left front burner of your stove for what is now 36 and a half hours, I promise you that you are not going to need an alarm clock to wake you up. Because the smell is going to crawl out of the pot of gumbo on the legs that it grew overnight. And no, those of you who pay very close attention in English class, I'm not speaking in metaphor. I actually mean that literally. Like the stench is going to grow legs and feet. It is going to crawl up out of the pot, across the kitchen, across the living room, up the back stairs, go down the back hall, under your door frame, and find with the precision of a laser that thing on the front of your face that you call a nose, and you will be awake. And now I was not happy because I knew what the stench meant. Oh yes, I knew what was waiting for me on the left front burner of that stove, having not been cleaned by anyone, least of all the guy that made the mess. So I throw my door open, I'm stomping down the hall, trying to get anybody's attention, trying to let anyone know how unhappy I am. Stomping down the hall, living with 9 other people, can't find one. And the guy that made the gumbo is like, where's Waldo? Nobody knows where he went. It's like he made the gumbo as a practical joke and then just skipped town, to see if anyone else would clean up his mess. So I go down the stairs, and I look across the living room into the kitchen. I see the pot of gumbo, and I am confident, even though it's been 23 years since, I can still remember very clearly the gumbo seeing me. And it was in that moment, not a moment earlier, but definitely not a moment later, that I came to understand probably the most important lesson I've ever learned about anything, right? Not just household cleanliness and the importance of cleaning up the mess in your kitchen, but about any subject in or out of the classroom. What was the lesson? The lesson was it didn't really matter anymore, did it? Whether I had made the mess, right? It didn't really matter anymore, did it? Whether I was the one who created all that nastiness in the environment that I shared with those other people. The only thing that mattered was I was tired of living in it. And I was tired of living in it because it was starting to affect me. See, the same thing is true with human society. The same thing is true with our country and with our planet. When we get tired of living in the mess that other people made, then we'll clean it. Not because we did it, not because we're to blame for it, but because we are the only ones left to do the work. And if we don't do it, it doesn't get done. And we pass it down to our kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, if we're lucky either now or at some point in the future to have them. We kick the problem down the road and we leave it on them, and there is something profoundly unfair about that. See, that's what we've done for you. We've already done that to you. We've left this problem in your hands because we were not sensible enough or committed enough or just not strong enough, even if we were committed, to get the job done. So now I hand you that problem, and I say to you, as I say to my own daughters, you have to figure out, both today, throughout something like Black History Month, but more importantly, throughout the course of your lives, what you intend to do to clean up, in metaphorical terms, the gumbo, right? The mess that has been handed to you by past generations, some of whom tried valiantly to clean it, others of whom didn't really try very hard at all, but all of whom have brought us to this place. Because if we don't do it, we'll have to come back into this room in 20 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, and have the same conversation. Although I tell you, I assure you, that if that day comes and we haven't fixed this problem, or at least moved significantly down the road towards it, those children, those grandchildren, those great-grandchildren will curse us for our inaction. We and they deserve far better than that. Thank you all so much for your attention.